And now we're going to move on to the technologies as we look a little further forward, although I guess my panelists would say this is just the here and now with a blink of the eye going forward. So we've already heard from Adam in terms of he set out his stall, so we'll be able to engage in discussion around that in a moment. And we're going to give an opportunity to Ian and Payam to actually take us into some further extensions of technology around, in particular, genomic applications and where they're going, and also 5G and connectivity. So if we can have the first slide up, you've got a few minutes to just introduce yourself briefly, as the previous panel did. Ian, you're first up with low-cost genomics, and you've got 5 minutes to tell us a little bit about where you feel we're going here, please.
Yeah, hello. I'm, you've had the big man from Glasgow. I'm the wee man from the Highlands. And I'm going to start off with a few confessions. So, firstly, I've got far too many slides, so I'm going to skip quite a few. Secondly, when I was putting the slides together, I went straight to my comfort zone, which was to describe a product. And I'm realizing, listening to the discussion today, I maybe should have been a little more future thinking rather than describing what we have today. But I will cast my thoughts forward. Thirdly, I Googled both of my fellow panelists last night, sitting in my hotel room, and I'm exceptionally intimidated by the videos that I saw of them doing exactly this kind of thing.
Of course we're intimidated.
It's not a drinking contest. So, yeah, and fourthly, I'm not a vet. So I thought I'd start off by doing something I can really confidently say none of you have ever seen anybody do before. Let's see if you're impressed. I'm about to remove a DNA sequencing machine from my pocket. You look slightly underwhelmed. I was hoping for I was hoping for hats in the air and a big cheer there. But yeah, so until this was invented, for somebody to have taken a sequencer out of their pocket, they would either have to have been a magician or a giant, because I don't know if you've ever seen a sequencer before, but they're normally the size of a small car. The smallest ones might be the size of a domestic appliance like a washing machine. So, so I'll crack on with a few slides. So am I going the wrong direction? Yeah. So I'm going to skip past a lot, but just to say that our company is a UK company, Oxford Nanopore Technologies, and the mission is to enable the analysis of any living thing by any person in any environment. So that's a very bold and forward-looking ambition. I'm just going to get a little bit technical, because I want you to understand how it works. So what we have inside this device are lots of little pores, protein pores, and they're embedded in a membrane. And current can't get through the membrane, but electrons can flow through the pores. Anything that goes through the pore, in the pore, near the pore, disrupts the current. So I keep going in the wrong direction. And so here's a DNA strand going through the pore, and that squiggly line is the disruption in the current. And that everything that goes through or near the pore has a different squiggly line. So in this case, we're looking at the 4 bases of DNA, or RNA, or any modified version of those 5 molecules. Yeah, so I'll skip past that because I've already showed you the 3-dimensional version of this. That's the sequencer as it is today. It's the first time I've managed to go in the right direction, so I'm obviously learning. It plugs into a laptop. So I suppose the first thing I want to get over about this is, is its size. So it means you can take it anywhere. You could take it to a farm. Every clinic could have one. It doesn't have to sit inside a specialised laboratory. It even opens up the possibility that people could just be running these at home and taking measurements from themselves, from their fridges, or from their pets. It's been used in a lot of different places already. Probably the most impressive of which was the International Space Station. So it was the first extraterrestrial sequencing event. We didn't sequence an extraterrestrial, but we did do it off the planet. It even works, apparently, we used it to track Zika outbreak, Ebola outbreak. It's used in the jungle, down mines. In fact, it even works in Wales. So it's now there's future iterations coming of the technology. I'll skip past this one and just to give you the idea of where we're going with this. Here's a device that would fit into a mobile phone. So there's a little bit of electronics here, and then a very small consumable. So the idea is to just have a small plastic consumable that will then plug into an electronic device. Obviously, that makes it even more portable, but also it makes it extremely low cost. The device would cost an awful lot more than the phone would cost an awful lot more than the sequencer at that point, or the phone would be the sequencer. The other thing is, it's a bit of a misnomer to say it's really that easy to use. You do have to extract DNA, you do have to do something with DNA before you put it on, but we're also miniaturizing and automating that into a tiny little device that's full of heaters and magnets and can separate things and move stuff around, move small amounts of lipid around and mix them. So the ultimate goal would be to hook that up to the sequencer, be something you could carry in your pocket. Let's say an animal is born on a farm, you put its ear tag in to register the animal, you inadvertently take a bit of tissue, take that tissue, you put it in this device, and what you get is the whole genome of that animal. So it would require no user skill. So it's already being used today to track outbreaks. This is probably the most valuable immediate thing, is looking at pathogens. So you can use it to track Zika virus, Ebola virus. And what it does is within minutes, it lets you know if the virus is there or not. There are lots of other ways of doing that. You can use PCR to do that. But if you just leave the thing running, that pore just keeps sequencing. It doesn't stop. And it'll get you to the point where you have information about every base in the genome of the virus. Or bacterial pathogens. So your presence or absence, is the pathogen there or not? And then what is it resistant to? What antibiotic should I be using? And what strain is it? And how does it relate to all the other strains we've seen? So again, for outbreak monitoring. So yeah, I'll skip past everything else. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll move on then to Payam, and you're going to move us into an area of 5G, Payam.
5G. Probably Ian said most of the things well, I wanted to focus on. Iwan also mentioned a lot about IoT I wanted to talk about. I'll give it a try. I didn't want to talk about DNA sequencing either. If you look at how communication technologies have evolved over the past, when they started, most of the effort was focused on providing communication at any time, any place. But over a decade or so, we have started focusing on a new trend, which we call it Internet of Things. It's not really one technology. It's a mix of different things. But basically, there are small sensors or actuators which are connected to network, and they have computation power. Once you have sensor connected to a network, you can collect data from real world. And once you have computation power, you can also start processing that data at edge on the device itself, and also provide communication between different devices. And also communication technologies have been evolving by always looking at speed, providing wider reach, and also making them faster and faster. We heard about Moore's law this morning, and we're doubling up or increasing exponentially the capacity of communication and bandwidth we provide. But we will be bound to laws of physics. There will be a time we can't like go beyond the speed of light at the moment, at least by the science we know now, or the rules of physics. But also, it's not all about speed. This is a picture I took from a recent BBC program. Was about human brain, and they asked sprinters to start their run by looking at light and also by hearing a gun. Intuitively, I thought if obviously light travels faster, if you look at the light, probably you'll start running faster. But when they asked the same sprinters to trigger the run, actually they noticed people who hear the gun start around 40 milliseconds sooner than the other group, simply because our human brain takes more time to process visual information. It's not just about the speed, it's about how fast you can process the information. The same concept applies to networks. In the past, we have always worked to make the networks faster and faster, but also we're getting to a point, it becomes more and more important how we're going to process that information and for what purpose we're going to use that. Then I work in the 5G Innovation Center at the University of Surrey. Then 5G is obviously about the speed, providing wider reach. We heard about connectivity problem in rural areas, providing better connectivity, more reliability. Obviously, part of the 5G work and some key elements is still focusing on providing better connection, more reliable connection, and higher bandwidths. I'm talking about something in gigabits rate over your mobile phones within the next few years. By 2020, probably the first generations of commercial 5G handsets should be available in the market. Or that's what our industry partners, they're planning to do. But it's not only about providing faster communication. It's also looking at new trends. More and more, we are now having devices they need to be connected. If you look at how the communication networks, cellular networks operate, they have lots of overhead. When you have many people in one place, obviously you need more capacity. If you go to a sports event or a big like music festival, your connectivity either drops or you have slower and much slower connection. Part of it because those networks are designed for the best possible estimations, but often providing larger capacities is expensive for communication networks. They rely on the best estimate. They can see how many people will be around that area. But more and more, if you start deploying devices, and if those devices are going to use cellular communication, then the cellular communication needs also to change how you're looking at the communication. Differences between mobile devices, sensors, or low-end devices looking to connect to the network. Then 5G also focusing on then narrowband communication, looking at large, high density deployments, and also to higher spectrum of bandwidths, looking at, for example, virtual reality, fast communication. And also there are technologies being developed making the networks more intelligent. We call them network slicing, then providing guaranteed bandwidths and quality for certain mission critical application. For example, if you are going to have an ambulance going to use that 5G communication to send some really vital information, you want to make sure you have enough bandwidths, enough connectivity, and good quality for those communications. The current networks, within their own backbone, they don't provide this differential between different connectivity between different traffic. And that's part of the core, again, 5G design. As an example, I just wanted to show what you can do with this technology. Over the past 2 years, we have been working on using sensors, helping patients with dementia and also their carers and clinicians. This is a project funded by the Department of Health. We work at 8 companies. We deploy sensors in patients' homes. These sensors are in 2 categories. Some of them are environmental monitoring sensors. They monitor like temperature, light, humidity, motion, movement around the house. We monitor how long people sit on a sofa, how many times they switch on the kettle, how long they watch TV. We have sensors collect all this information. And we have sensors which monitor people's heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, physiological symptoms. Then we've developed a system which integrates this information in a connected system. And then we delegate part of this work to machines. The machines start learning from these trends, find, for example, how somebody's blood pressure fluctuates, and they find what is a norm for one patient, for example. They start personalizing it. And then you start finding deviation from those. And then we create alerts, which we have also worked with my colleagues at the NHS. Then we have developed clinical pathways. When we generate an alert, then a clinician or group of monitoring staff, they know what to do with this information. If you look at this block, this is an engineer's way of showing someone's activity over 2 weeks. Each color it's not very visible here, but each color will show a type of activity. And these are 1,400 minutes in a day. Our devices also tell us how people move about in day-to-day life. We ask machines to learn what is someone's norm. We learn what type of activities someone does and what is the probability of moving from one activity to another activity. Then we observe a patient around 2 months, and we train a system what is a norm for someone. And then we start looking for 2 weeks how much they deviate from that. Once you learn that, and then you can now delegate to machines to start monitoring patients. And what we do, we start identifying, we have model, this is like a physical system, if you're interested, it's like looking at entropy in the system. Then you have more stochastic behavior, the entropy increases. And by detecting that, then we start flagging abnormal days from our patients. And if this happens in a sequence, then we generate alerts and inform our clinicians. I think I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. So we're starting to look out now to more and more connectivity and more data and the challenges that come along with that. I'm just thinking, first of all, Adam, do you have any comments around this? I mean, you were presenting on the different ways companies are developing these things, but it does seem to me what's been coming out is some of the expansion of all these data and then how these are synthesized and integrated, and also the implications for this connectivity around and transmission of data as well. These seem to be some of the really difficult things for us to all cope with.
Yeah, so maybe I'll make a couple comments around there. I would say, first of all, this sort of connected vision that we've been describing is shared by lots of people. This isn't necessarily a new sort of concept or idea. And this is the same sort of belief that companies today that penetrate tens of thousands of veterinary practices are moving towards, right? So you look at a company like IDEXX as an example. They've built in some of their machine learning capabilities to some of their new diagnostic tools. And in the last year, they've increased 30-fold the amount of images that are coming off their new urinary diagnostic machine. And so I think the vision, how it kind of comes together and who wins and who loses is going to be interesting. But I think that puts entrepreneurs in an interesting position, which is if your business is eventually we're going to have all this data and we're going to figure out how to generate value, that's a really difficult mountain to climb. And so I think the challenge is in a lot of these spaces is what data can you work with tomorrow to generate value for a customer, to get people paying and using your services to eventually get to that end goal. And I think sometimes that's a really difficult balance for people to strike. And I think a lot of good ideas and a lot of good companies never reached that moment where they were generating enough value and didn't really have a sustainable business model. And then the second piece I will just maybe comment on is there's a lot of ways even today through information that we can add value to the existing in-clinic experience. And so as a bit of an anecdote, I led a project with IBM Watson where we were building a medical decision support tool to help veterinarians. It took us a year. We were the first IBM Watson partner in Canada, first one in the veterinary space. We had 10 times more training pairs than any other Watson partner on earth when we finalized our project. And it failed. Like terribly failed. We spent $1 million as a company. And it failed because we didn't solve a problem that people actually cared about, and they didn't want to use our software in the way that we had designed it. On the flip side, though, through a series of prototyping through a new company, we were able to, in a fraction of the time for a fraction of the resources, by focusing on client management as opposed to patient management, generate a lot of value. And so I think the ability to understand, I think a recurring thing that's come out is like, what is that initial entry point is really critical when you look at building towards that vision.
I'm interesting there. You did talk about winners and losers, and I guess what we're all quite interested in this room with is whether everybody can be winners. I mean, you were particularly thinking about losers around professionals.
No, so no, I don't think I think if you look at all the companies right now, how they're ranked, how they're valued, the answer is no. But I think that people underestimate how much better things could be for individual veterinarians, because in all these models that we've been talking about, there's pet owners and there's care providers. Everybody in the middle, the models, the technologies, the companies, the business models, those are going to have to change, and there's going to be very rigid institutions that have invested a lot in certain structures of relationships, and those will go away. But when you look at individual care providers, I think they're going to have more flexibility in how they can practice and more autonomy, and they're going to be able to use their skills in ways that we can't even imagine. And so I think the future for veterinary medicine is really bright. I know a lot of big companies are very scared because they recognize that they're going to have to change, and that's very difficult. So I don't think you can have this really transformational change if everybody stays the same.
No. Well, that's really set us up now for discussion. Questions of the panel. They've laid out their stalls, so who'd like to kick us off? Yes.
Thank you. One of the things which, sort of listening even from the previous sessions, and I'd almost ask sort of Gwen and Greg, but Adam might be able to answer it. One of the challenges at the moment about big data is integrating it from everywhere in order to be used in a functional way that benefits the end user. And at the moment, I don't know how that's going to be done, and nobody seems to be giving the answer other than saying it's going to be there.
Well, it can be done.
So I can give some specific examples in the veterinary space because that problem is being solved. And it's being solved on 3 levels. So the first level is there are more companies now that are developing point solutions that require integration with legacy systems. And so I think 5 years ago this was a really big problem. But now you look at these bigger companies and their entire schedule for every conference is 20 startups that are trying to get access for their data. So it's less of a one-off conversation, and now they have people in place to be able to do that. The second has been the introduction of middleware companies. And so in the veterinary space, there's no less than 5 companies right now that are solving that integration problem. IDEX recently acquired one as well. And so you're going to see that those capabilities are less bespoke, and they become a layer that anybody can plug into, which allows us to increase value both ways.
It's not as easy as you make out, but it's certainly doable.
You're talking to the wrong people.
I'm wondering, Payam, I think you'll be able to help us here because you seem to be describing the system of exceptions, as it were. So one way of solving it is just to look at what's different.
We had exactly the same problem Jamie mentions when we started the dementia project. We work with 8 companies. If you get solutions from different people, you will end up having multiple apps. Like our nurses would have ended up running different apps, and also your like endpoints, the technical endpoints, talked in different languages. The solution we took, you need a part of it regulatory here and also standardization. Because this project was funded by the Department of Health, we set a rule. And we created a common language. And the rule was, this common language, if you follow, you will become part of this project. And what has happened now, we have a system, which you see these devices are provided by like 8 different companies. No matter what device you use to take my blood pressure, any of them you plug should work because we just get a standard way of representing that data. Obviously, in a larger context, if you have multiple stakeholders, it's very difficult. But technically, this is not a technical problem.
It's the collaborative problem.
Yes, but if you create also a best practice, then if you set it as a foundation, as a best practice. In this case, for example, we went and looked at how NHS stores their data. They use a standard called HL7 or FHIR. I don't know in vet practice what standards are common. And we created this representation compatible with HL7 and FHIR. And we said, if you want to join this project, we want this data to be in future integrated to GP practices, and that's how you're going to present it. But obviously, yeah, we were in a position because we were working with the NHS, we could say that. I can see in real settings it's more complicated than that.
Stephen, do you want me to add anything to that?
Well, I was just going to ask Ian to come, because he's dealing with a whole genome from which he's fishing out, Ian. So do you want to comment on the data issues there?
Yeah, I think if I've understood the question correctly, and if I've understood the other 2 answers, I'm in agreement. It's something that is already happening. And it seems like the 3 ingredients to me are the will to do it, funding, and time. So when you get those 3 things together, it'll happen. And there are lots of good examples so far. I'll give you my pet example. Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, obviously in Ireland, they have a huge database, and they have now genotyped, generated large data sets, genomic data sets, for now over 1 million animals. And those are all linked to phenotypes. They have perfect pedigree because of that. But that's taken them, 15 years to build up the database. It was alive for 10 years before they started integrating genomics. The funding comes from the pharma in the form of EU tariff. So, that there's a funding source, there's political will, and it's taken a long time. GEL, Genomics England, is another example where the government, UK government, or the English NHS put up, I think, what was the number, £500 million to sequence 100,000 NHS patients, and that'll build an excellent database that will be mineable by clinicians well into the future. So these things are happening, but they need those three ingredients, I think.
Thank you.
This isn't necessarily an answer. It may put some of the others in a little bit of context. I agree entirely with the answers they've given, that there are middleware companies springing up to do this, to bring data into a format that it can be used. However, in some industries, we've seen that stranglehold companies, if they can get their hands on enough of the data proportionally, will deliberately make it difficult to do that. John Deere have been doing that in big data in agriculture in the US. They've got consumer-facing, so they can try and become a single monopoly provider. I don't think we've got the same size of companies competing in this area, so hopefully it will go the way we're all wanting it to, but just keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, I think this was interesting. I mean, does the panel have a view on ownership of data? Because I think it came out in the last panel that we should own our data and others are licensed to use it, not the other way around. Is that the general view?
I guess I totally agree. People who generate data should own data, and Google is one of the best examples. Most of the intelligent algorithms Google has generated actually is using our data, but we don't have much control on it. European Commission was behind taxing Google in European countries when people search Google because they claim you're using our citizens' data. I don't know how far they have gone. But there are other implications as well. While we are working in this machine learning to develop these algorithms, I had an interesting case. One of our collaborators saying you are using our data to actually train your algorithms and you design your algorithms based on our data. Then actually we have a share in your algorithm as well.
I think, like, maybe this is an interesting question back to the group. Like, how many of you have an account that you sign in with your Google or Facebook login as opposed to creating like a new? I'm assuming most of you, the rest of you might not realize you're doing that. The reality is on a day-to-day basis, you're giving up ownership of your data in exchange for a better experience. And I think the problem arises, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Actually, a group called Rock Health that looks at digital health, they found that about 70% of patients were willing to give doctors access to their information in exchange for a better healthcare experience. And I think a lot of the companies are less interested in like your individual data and more like aggregate trends to either monetize it or look for opportunities to deliver more value. I think the transparency, though, piece is really important because nothing makes consumers more angry than to find out that their data was used in a fashion that was opposed to their values. And I think that there's ways that companies can be more transparent there. You brought us on?
Yeah, I suppose I would say that whoever is paying for the storage of the data or generating the data probably owns the data. All the large genomics companies take a hands-off approach. Use the machines as data engines. But those can be ported to cloud environments. But the person that paid for it, the person who generated the data, is paying for the storage of the data. They own it.
One thing that's also very important is the security and taking people who collect this data accountable towards that data. If I know where your pet is, probably I can guess also where you are. And if you're not home, and I can guess actually where are you moving. And that's one of the key issues again. The more we collect data about people, personalized data, the privacy issues also become more and more severe about if you lose part of that data. And you hear stories about that every day almost.
Yes, you've been patiently waiting, Bradley. Carry on.
Thank you, Steve. I haven't really begun to understand what goes on inside that magical box that Ian showed us, but I do have an inkling that what comes out of it is really sort of revolutionary. And I think in the time available to him, Ian just gave us a very simplistic example of how it can help in diagnostics. But from the bit that I am aware of, it seems that genomics could have is going to have a really radical effect upon our treatment modalities. And I think through today, we've kind of looked mainly at the interface between our patients and but actually the nature of treatments, I think, is going to radically change with genomics, CRISPR technology that actually will be tailoring our treatments to individual animals. We'll be maybe using genomics to actually fix bits that are wrong, that the chemotherapeutic agents we've been using will seem just like poisons and we won't understand why we ever used them in the first place. Maybe the same may prove true of antibiotics. So I wonder if Ian could give us his view of the possible consequences of us being able to actually cheaply, quickly and easily read the genetic profile of our patients?
So I think, Ian, that's a really great setting us up on treatment. I think Atul Gawande pointed out in one of his talks that currently 60% of individuals in various specialist services are either have inappropriate treatment or incomplete treatment on the human side, and there are patient and practitioner related issues there. So how is this going to move us into different areas in terms of treatment and perhaps the quality of what's going on?
Well, I think for the moment anyway, it's as you described, it's directed treatments using the correct chemotherapy or using the correct antibiotic. So, and fundamentally, what these devices and technologies like that will do is just allow you to see an awful lot more. They don't, at the present time or in the short time, generate new types of treatment, but they certainly allow you to pair your treatments in a far more specific and targeted way and not waste money on a lot of drugs that an antibiotic is resistant to, or your patient might, or a drug your patient might not respond to. But the other thing is, once you are collecting that data all the time, and Adam was alluding to this, once you're collecting that data all the time, you will see new patterns emerging. You will find new causal variations in genomes for which there are previously no known links. And then we'll be able to perhaps, if we find a mutation that underlies a certain pathology, and it's in a certain pathway, there might be also a drug to that pathway with a completely different underlying variant. So we'd always been looking, it's effectively the same thing, but we'd always been looking for the wrong thing. And so I think more and more of these patterns will emerge as we collect more data on more individuals.
Could there not be a world where we use CRISPR technology to actually change those sequences, fix them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's already happening. So it's been used in cattle to get rid of horns in dairy cattle. It's been used, delivered by virus vectors to treat genetic disorders in human patients already. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you want to come up with CRISPR-based techniques, you have to know what the variation you're trying to, what the error you're trying to correct is. So this will find the errors and then allow us to correct them.
Yeah, Payam, do you or Adam, do you have any comment on how your 5G, for instance, is improving treatment as well as the monitoring side?
I have to be very careful. We are technology enablers. We provide connectivity and we provide analytical process behind that to allow, like let's say, practices, different domains to provide the services they provide better. But in terms of what 5G in combination with connected sensors can do, then if you start collecting continuous data about an animal or a human being, what changes? In the past, you had fragmented information about that subject. For example, if you collect my heart rate, you would have collected it once a day, once a week. The current practice is maybe once every 2 weeks when I see my GP if I have a cardiac condition. But if you start collecting that information continuously, then you start moving towards more predictive and preventative models. And that's how future is changing by this information. But I ought to say also, most of the current wearable and sensing technologies we have, they are not at the moment as accurate as medical sensors. For example, the smart watches we wear, I don't have one, but monitors your heart rate and body temperature, they are not as accurate as, for example, taking someone's ECG. But obviously, if you have an ECG data, for example, for a patient every other day, and continuously use this semi-accurate data, you always can calibrate your semi-accurate measurements towards that real measurement. I think that's how 5G and connected technologies are changing in short term. In long run, I think in next 20 years, probably we'll see more actually very precise sensors, probably hopefully close to what medical precision we need as wearables.
So, another question, please. Yeah.
My question is just, with developing any technology, you obviously, I believe, have the end user in mind from the outset. And I guess, the end user here would probably be the vet in veterinary practice doing a 10-minute veterinary consult. And listening to all the conversations we had today, I'm just seeing data overload. And I don't understand how with all this data coming from the collar the dog's wearing to the data that is transmitted from the from home via the mobile phones, how in a 10-minute consultation something's got to give. There's no such thing as a free lunch. You can have all this data on the outside, but something's going to get missed. And I'm not necessarily sure that we are keeping up with what's happening, listening to all of this, what's happening in a consultation room where you have 10 minutes. And what's happening outside the consultation room is 50 people waiting to see you, and you start getting nervous. And now you have to go and look at data from a dog, how much a dog drank last week, last year, how much he was walking this week compared to last week. Are you dealing with that? Have you tested it in the practice?
So the question essentially is, we're time pressured. We're all time pressured in our professional roles. How do we cope with more and more when we're time pressured?
Yeah, so a couple of comments there. First of all, I think I'm a big believer that the business model and the process of the veterinary experience has to evolve in parallel. I think we heard that from lots of people. If we envision this future and it's 100 different data sources and the practice looks the same, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's not going to be that. And I'm fairly convinced of that. So I think that we already are at a point where what veterinarians value most is their time. And whenever you introduce something new, you are eating, regardless of all these other benefits, time and time again, I keep hearing from our process and our customers that what they want is more time back. And whenever you're introducing something new, that is adding more time to their day. And so I think that a lot of these different sort of spokes of this future model there's a different hub, so to speak. And I think that there's ways in which we can begin to address that. Speaking to your experience about being in the hospital, when we started our product, we actually put people in the hospital. When we talked about the integrations, we did the integrations manually in the background to create the experience and see if people actually wanted it, because we weren't going to develop technology if we found from our tests that it just wasn't the experience that the veterinary practices wanted. So we took that very seriously because of the fact that, frankly, I'd been a part of or observer to many failed technology projects that didn't get that piece right. So I think they're very valid points.
If what we do, if it doesn't help you and it actually increases your effort, actually we are not doing the right thing. The whole thing should be done in a way which reduces the time and improves your performance. In terms of the project we did in dementia, what we started talking to our clinicians and asking them what they would like to see. It didn't come from the technology. And we created a living lab. We started bringing patients and their carers and asked them to try this technology. Then, I think you said earlier, it starts with the problem. And if it adds more complexity, you get more data, which probably you didn't need. We are not doing the right thing. I think you should start focusing on a problem and solving in the way which you are going to use it. Because end of the day, if all these technologies are brilliant, if you don't have a use for that data and doesn't provide actionable information to you, they are not useful.
Okay. Yeah. Question there.
Adam raised this earlier on in the day, and at the risk of describing a dystopian future where technologies coalesce under a single well-known global multinational company that owns the feeding, the treating, the diagnostics, the primary care, tertiary care, quaternary care of a single patient. What risks are there in that scenario?
So certainly that is one possible vision. I think what's more likely is that we live in a time where it has never been quicker and cheaper for one person to go out with an idea and make a really significant impact. And I think if I was in the shoes of those bigger companies, I would be less concerned of what happens if we take over everything, and more concerned of there's 1,000 people that are trying to beat us at every part of our business. I think that I think it is a risk. You look at other examples. Amazon's probably the best example, right? And I think in some ways there are concerns around behaviors like that. If you have one company that reaches $1 trillion in market cap and has the ability to go and dismantle industries, is that necessarily a good thing? I don't necessarily think so. So I think it is a valid concern. And as these global players, both outside of the animal health space and within have more significant impact, there will be mechanisms, and I think that's where in part regulatory behaviors come in. I think, you look at things like even paying taxes, right? The degree of like regulation around the automobile industry looks very different than what Uber had to encounter. And yes, it was driven by a consumer need, but I think that some big issues around like retraining and job destruction or creation and what that looks like are going to be significant. And then I think more in the veterinary space, I just think it's more of there's more opportunity. I think that there's a far fewer. There's so much left that we could do for animals, and there's going to be so much value creation. There's so many animals that don't receive any veterinary care. There's so many animals that receive 10% of what veterinarians would like to do. And so I think that on the path to getting to 100% accessible worldwide, we haven't even really talked about developing countries, there's a lot of value yet to be created. And frankly, I don't see one company and one model dominating all aspects of that, if that makes sense. Good question.
Yeah, at the moment in genomics, I would say that we see two different models. This is kind of a European model, where the thing will be government funded. So I talked about the million cows in Ireland. That's the organisation that houses the data, uses, interprets the data, allows access to the data, was set up solely to further the greater good for the farming community and the economy of Ireland. And then there's the kind of the American model, where the group in America that's doing genomic analysis on millions of samples would be things like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, and there it's very much in private ownership. But again, they can only really fully leverage the asset of their database and monetize that if they're providing you with something that you want and something that is good service. I can't imagine a scenario in which they would ever be incentivized to produce something that was bad for us all. So I'm optimistic.
Okay, thanks. Right.
Like any other innovation, I mean, there's always a risk big companies might move in. But even if you look at like web space, which is well dominated by large companies, still there is space for innovation. And I believe these technologies are evolving very fast and changing, and every day you see new devices, better communication. And obviously there is a lot of space for smaller companies, new innovations to move in. And I don't see like any of the current large companies at the moment have the momentum and capacity and spectrum, a wide spectrum of covering all the requirements that are out there.
Okay, thank you. Jackie.
So mine isn't a question, I just wanted to make a comment on the previous question. So I think that I was very excited by the idea of all this extra data that we can get about our patients, but I think we can fall into the trap of thinking it always has to be the vet. And it doesn't always have to be the vet, because there's a huge amount of interpretation that could have been done with the client, with the nurse, prior to them coming to the vet. And I think that some of us have this real mindset that it always has to be the vet. So we have to get away from that and work towards teams working together.
And I guess that's where you're talking about extended teams, including scientists, software engineers, experts on creating and collecting data, ultimately.
I think it's also like really important to recognize today, kind of speaking to that point, that like the role of like a veterinary nurse or a receptionist is basically impossible. Just so everyone's aware, right? We expect them to be incredibly proficient in areas ranging from triage to client communication to management, while paying them minimum wage and not training them. And that is considered to be status quo. So I think as we look at some of these new areas, there's going to be opportunities to reinvent certain jobs, be more specific, and recruit for specific areas of support. And overall, I think it's okay sometimes to admit like the system is broken today. Like I think the reason that we're all here is because we see a world that could be radically better. When you look at the burnout of veterinarians, the financial debt, these aren't like legacy systems that we should be okay with. We should be committed to reinventing, and I think it's going to create more opportunities for other roles in the practice.
Yeah, I mean, just to answer your point and go back a couple of questions there, the only thing getting delivered back to the vet should be something that allows them to be more accurate, and they should be getting it sooner than they used to get it. So it shouldn't eat any time or put any further burden on vets. There's no problem.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take one last question. Jan, thank you.
Thank you very much. My question goes more to the chair, if that's allowed. I would like to ask you, do you foresee that in the future an organization like the Royal College could take measures against veterinarians who do not keep up with modern developments, with modern technology, who do not use the big data? I think you could stay behind if you don't do that.
I think that is an open question in terms of where we go as a society with regulation. We're all players in that debate, as indeed the RCVS is, and as many people in this room will know, we're currently consulting on various fronts around the future for veterinary legislation. But I think this is a great place for us to pause before I hand over and think about where we were in terms of Jackie emphasising the veterinary team and us thinking about this collaborative activity. And it actually takes us rather nicely back to the theme of our very first speaker, who talked about the roles of professionals in the future, reinventing ourselves in various ways, new roles appearing, and the empowerment of different members of that team in different ways. So I think that's a really good place for us to now hand over in terms of future directions of travel. And I'm going to, first of all, I'd like you just to thank our panellists here.